Princess Ysalara stood in the great hall of the Celestine Dominion's palace, where ancient marble floors shone under the soft glow of countless crystal chandeliers. The palace was vast and full of history, decorated with tall statues and colorful tapestries that told the story of a proud civilization. From a very young age, Ysalara had been taught to lead her people with calm wisdom and gentle strength. Today, as she prepared for an important meeting with many world leaders, she felt a steady peace in her heart. The princess walked slowly along the hall, her footsteps echoing softly as she passed by groups of busy attendants and advisors. Every corner of the palace was filled with reminders of the Dominion's long and glorious past. Fresh flowers in delicate vases added a hint of sweetness to the cool air. In this grand setting, Ysalara always felt a deep connection to her people and their traditions. Today was not an ordinary day. Delegates from many different planets were coming to the palace, each bringing unique customs and ideas to share. Ysalara believed that learning from other cultures could help her people grow and become stronger. She looked forward to the meeting with a sense of quiet excitement, ready to listen and learn. However, among the usual reports and schedules, one piece of news caught the princess's attention and made her pause. A human soldier was to join the gathering. In all the years of the Celestine Dominion, very few humans had ever visited, and they were often known for their bold and lively spirit. This soldier was said to be brave, unafraid to speak his mind, and full of energy that did not fit the calm image most people expected. Hearing this, Ysalara felt a small, unexpected flutter in her heart, a feeling both curious and uncertain. Standing by a large window that overlooked a sky filled with glittering stars, she wondered about the man who would soon enter her world. The stars seemed to whisper secrets of distant places and unknown adventures. The idea that someone so different might bring a fresh perspective to her carefully ordered court was both exciting and a little frightening. After a long moment by the window, Ysalara took a deep, steady breath and turned back to the busy hall. With quiet determination, she moved toward the ceremonial room where the delegates would soon gather. Each step reminded her that change was a natural part of life, even if it sometimes made her feel uneasy. In her heart, Princess Ysalara hoped that the human soldier would bring not only strength and courage, but also a spark of something new. Even if his arrival stirred feelings she had never felt before, she was ready to meet him with the same calm resolve that had guided her for so many years. Today was the start of a new chapter, one that might change the future of the Celestine Dominion forever. Captain Elias Ward, a human soldier, arrived at the Celestine Dominion Palace on a bright, clear morning. His arrival was unexpected and filled the grand corridors with a new energy. Unlike the refined diplomats in elegant attire, Elias wore a simple uniform that showed his strong and practical nature. He walked with a steady gait, his eyes focused and determined, and his presence brought whispers of change among the palace staff. As he entered the long marble corridor, guards flanking him kept a respectful distance. The guards carried him through halls lined with ancient portraits and intricate tapestries that told the history of a proud people. Many in the palace paused to watch him. He was different from those who had come before. His look was straightforward, and his manner was unpretentious. People murmured quietly, curious about the human soldier who carried both the scars of battle and the hope of a new alliance. Outside the palace, the city buzzed with excitement. The local citizens talked about the arrival of this unexpected guest. They had heard stories of humans, soldiers known for their bold spirit and fierce determination. Some admired their courage, while others wondered how such a simple man could fit into the strict and formal ways of the Celestine Dominion. Yet, none could deny the spark of energy that Captain Ward brought with him. Inside, in the main hall, Princess Ysalara stood near a large ornate window, watching the scene unfold. Known for her calm and collected demeanor, she was the picture of quiet strength. Yet, when her eyes met those of the human soldier, she felt a slight stirring within her heart. His warm smile and honest look were so different from the usual reserve of the palace, and even she could not hide a flicker of curiosity. Elias did not linger by the grand art or the historical artifacts that lined the halls. Instead, he moved directly toward the gathering room where the meeting was to begin. His purpose was clear: to represent the human side and share his own experiences of struggle and hope. Every step he took resonated with the determination of a soldier who had faced many challenges on distant battlefields. Yet his heart held a quiet optimism about forging new bonds. In the grand meeting room, dignitaries from many worlds were already seated, dressed in their traditional, ceremonial clothing. The air was filled with formal greetings and measured words. When Elias finally entered, his presence caused a brief pause. His simple attire and honest manner broke the rigid formalities, adding a fresh note to the old, familiar tone of the meeting. Captain Ward greeted the assembly with a firm nod and a sincere smile. His words, though few, were full of conviction and warmth. The human soldier sat down, and in that moment, the seeds of change were sown. Both the princess and the assembly sensed that his arrival marked the beginning of something new, a chapter where old traditions might learn to welcome the unexpected and the bold. The grand banquet hall of the Celestine Dominion was filled with soft lights, elegant decorations, and a strict air of tradition. At the long table, delegates from many worlds sat with their carefully chosen words and practiced smiles. Princess Ysulara moved among them like a gentle guardian, ensuring every custom was observed. She had spent years perfecting the art of calm diplomacy, and the evening was no exception. At the start of the banquet, all eyes turned toward Captain Elias Ward. His arrival had already stirred whispers, and now he took his seat with an air of quiet confidence. Unlike the formal tones and measured gestures of the other delegates, Elias wore a simple smile that felt natural and genuine. He did not hide behind grand titles or lofty words. Instead, he spoke in a clear, honest voice that was both refreshing and unexpected. As the dinner began, the conversation followed the usual formal path. However, during a short break, Elias leaned over and made a light remark about the overly complicated language used by some of the delegates. His comment was simple, even a little humorous, and it caused a ripple of quiet laughter among those near him. The moment was brief, but its effect was lasting. Soon, others began to speak with a slightly softer tone, their strict words giving way to more natural speech. Princess Ysulara watched this transformation with mixed feelings. For years, she had valued the precise and respectful language that defined her people. Yet the human soldier's unpretentious humor was beginning to dissolve the usual formality of the hall. At first, she felt a twinge of irritation. After all, rules were important. But as the laughter spread, and even the most reserved delegates began to smile, she realized that this change was not meant to disrespect tradition. Instead, it was a gentle challenge to the rigidity that sometimes made formal gatherings feel cold and distant. As the banquet continued, the collision of two very different worlds became more clear. The old customs of the Celestine Dominion met the direct, lively spirit of a human soldier. Captain Ward's comments, while lighthearted, had encouraged the delegates to relax their posture and speak from the heart. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Conversations that had begun as rehearsed speeches turned into warm, simple dialogues. Even those who had been known for their sternness started sharing small jokes and kind words. In the midst of this change, Princess Ysulara felt something stir within her. The strict rules and traditions that she had always held dear were softening under the influence of honest, uncomplicated speech. It was as if the formal walls of the banquet were giving way to the promise of a new way of connecting, a way that mixed order with a touch of spontaneity. Without even realizing it, the princess allowed herself to smile. The evening was turning into something unexpected. A collision of worlds where ancient customs met the vibrant, unfiltered energy of humanity. And in that blend, a spark of hope began to grow, hinting at a future where tradition and change could live side by side. After the banquet, Princess Ysulara walked through the quiet halls of the palace, her mind unsettled. The formal dinner had ended smoothly, but something felt different. She had spent years attending diplomatic meetings and grand events, yet tonight had been unlike any other. And the reason was clear: Captain Elias Ward. The human soldier had disrupted the usual flow of tradition, not with disrespect, but with something much harder to define. His words had been light, his laughter unfiltered, and yet he had managed to break through the cold formalities of the gathering. Even the sternest delegates had relaxed in his presence. That was not something Isolara had ever seen before. She stopped by a tall window, looking out at the twin moons that glowed over the Celestine city. The sight usually brought her peace, but tonight she found herself thinking about the way Elias had smiled so easily, the way he spoke without fear of making mistakes. He was different from the people she had known all her life, and somehow that difference made her feel restless. For as long as she could remember, Ysilara had been trained to control her emotions. A princess was supposed to remain composed at all times, showing neither excitement nor anger. And she had succeeded, until now. She had never felt flustered before. Not in the face of war, not in the most intense political debates, and certainly not during grand diplomatic gatherings. But this human, with his direct words and warm energy, had managed to disrupt the balance she had carefully maintained. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Your Highness," one of her advisors approached her with a polite bow. "The human soldier has retired to his quarters. Is there anything you require?" Ysilara hesitated for a moment. "No," she answered, her voice as steady as ever. "That will be all." The advisor nodded and walked away, leaving the princess alone once more. She exhaled slowly. It was foolish to dwell on this. Elias was just a visitor, a representative of his people, nothing more. And yet, her heart did not agree with her mind. There was something about him that unsettled her, something she could not explain. For the first time in her life, Princess Ysilara did not know how to react. She had faced enemies, resolved conflicts, and led her people with grace, but she had never been in a situation where her emotions betrayed her own understanding. She straightened her posture and turned away from the window. Tomorrow, she would face him again in the official negotiations. By then, she would regain her perfect calm. Or so she hoped. The next morning, the Celestine Palace was alive with quiet movement. Advisors and guards prepared for the important negotiations that would take place in the Grand Council chamber. Princess Ysilara walked through the halls with her usual grace, her expression calm and unreadable. But beneath that surface, her mind was restless. She was not looking forward to another formal discussion with the human soldier. Or perhaps, if she was honest with herself, she was. As she entered the council chamber, she saw Captain Elias Ward standing near one of the tall windows, gazing out at the city below. The morning light highlighted the sharp edges of his features, but his posture was relaxed, almost at ease. Unlike the other delegates, who carried themselves with measured poise, Elias moved as if he had no need for formality. Ysilara stepped forward, and he turned to face her. "Good morning, Princess," he greeted with an easy smile. She gave a small nod. "I trust you rested well." Elias chuckled. "As well as I can in a palace that looks too fancy to touch anything." His eyes held a playful glint, and for some reason, that made her heart feel lighter than it should. She pushed the thought aside. "The negotiations will begin soon. Before that, I would like to understand more about you." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Me?" She folded her hands behind her back. "You are unlike the other human representatives we have encountered. Your manner is different." Elias smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." He leaned slightly against the stone railing, looking thoughtful. "I grew up on a mining colony. Harsh conditions, not much luxury. But it taught me resilience. When I was old enough, I joined the military. Not for glory, just to survive." Ysilara listened carefully. She had expected a more noble background, something fitting for a diplomat. But Elias was not like the carefully polished representatives she was used to. "I've fought in wars," Elias continued, his voice quieter now. "I saw people I cared about die. I learned that politics doesn't always fix things. Sometimes you have to rely on the people next to you. not just the ones giving orders from a throne. He glanced at her, as if wondering how much she could understand. For the first time, Ysilera felt the weight of his words. The Celestine Dominion had avoided many conflicts due to careful diplomacy, but Elias had lived through battles where no negotiations could stop the bloodshed. "You have seen much hardship," she said softly. Elias nodded. "Yeah, but I've also seen hope. That's why I'm here. Maybe humans and Celestines can find something better than just trees on paper." His words carried a raw honesty that Ysilera was not used to hearing in diplomatic meetings, and once again she found herself unprepared for the emotions his presence stirred within her. The negotiations began in the Grand Council chamber, where leaders from different worlds sat around an enormous circular table. The room was decorated with banners of the Celestine Dominion, each one representing centuries of tradition and order. Princess Ysilera sat with perfect posture, her expression calm as she listened to the discussion. Captain Elias Ward, on the other hand, did not sit like the other delegates. While they maintained rigid formality, Elias leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on the table as if he were talking with comrades rather than political leaders. He listened closely but spoke only when necessary. The talks were going smoothly until an urgent message arrived. A Celestine officer rushed into the chamber, his face tense. "Your Highness, we have received distress signals from the outer colonies. There has been an attack." A hush fell over the room. Ysilera's eyes sharpened. "Who is responsible?" The officer hesitated before replying. "A rogue faction. They oppose the alliance and seek to destabilize our rule." The princess felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She had worked tirelessly to maintain peace, yet there were always those who wished for conflict. Elias leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then he finally spoke. "How far are they from the capital?" The officer glanced at him before answering. "They are still far, but their attacks on smaller settlements could escalate." Elias turned to Ysilera. "You know this won't stop at the colonies. They'll keep pushing until they test the strength of the Dominion." She knew he was right. The Celestine Dominion relied on strategy and diplomacy, but war was something they had not faced in generations. "We must reinforce the colonies," one of the council members suggested. "No." Ysilera's voice was firm. "We must understand the enemy's intent before we act." Elias studied her carefully. "Then let me help." The entire room turned toward him. Ysilera arched a brow. "You would go to the colonies?" Elias nodded. "I've dealt with rebels before. I know how they think. If we want to stop this before it gets worse, we need to gather information." One of the council members objected. "We cannot send a human soldier into Celestine territory without oversight." Elias smirked. "I'm not asking to go alone." He looked directly at Ysilera. "Come with me." A murmur spread across the chamber. No Celestine ruler had ever left the safety of the capital during a time of crisis, but Ysilera did not answer immediately. Instead, she found herself staring into Elias's unwavering gaze, feeling something unfamiliar, something close to trust. For the first time in her life, she considered stepping beyond the walls of her protected world. Princess Ysilera had never left the safety of the palace for a battlefield. She had always ruled from a distance, trusting her advisors and military commanders to handle threats. But as she stood in the docking bay, watching Captain Elias Ward prepare their small transport vessel, she felt something different, a quiet determination rising within her. Elias moved with practiced ease, checking weapons and securing supplies. Unlike the Celestine guards, who followed strict protocols, he worked with quick efficiency, showing no hesitation. When he noticed her watching, he smirked. "Still time to change your mind, princess," he said. Ysilera lifted her chin. "I do not make decisions lightly, Captain." Elias chuckled. "Didn't think so." Within minutes, they were airborne, heading toward the outer colonies where the attacks had taken place. The journey was not long, but in the enclosed space of the shuttle, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. "You ever been in a combat zone before?" Elias finally asked. "No," Ysilura admitted. I have studied warfare, but I have never seen it with my own eyes. Elias leaned back in his seat. It's different up close. Plans fall apart. People get scared. You have to think fast. She listened carefully. Unlike the polished words of her military advisors, Elias spoke from real experience. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through countless battles. As they approached the colony, the communication system crackled to life. This is Outpost 7, a distressed voice came through. We have suffered heavy damage. Many civilians injured. We need immediate assistance. Ysilura's heart clenched at the desperation in the voice. She turned to Elias, but he was already adjusting the ship's controls. Hang on, he said. We're going in fast. The transport ship descended into chaos. Fires burned across the settlement, and panicked civilians ran for cover. In the distance, the remnants of an attack were visible. Destroyed buildings, smoldering wreckage, and the eerie silence of loss. Ysilura had seen destruction in reports, but standing in the middle of it was different. The air smelled of smoke and ash, and the cries of the wounded filled her ears. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed. Elias, however, did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice firm. We need medics on those injured. Get the civilians to shelter. The Celestine guards, trained for ceremonial protection rather than real combat, hesitated. Ysilura saw it, the uncertainty in their eyes. Without thinking, she stepped forward. Follow his orders, she commanded. Her voice carried the authority of a ruler, and at once the guards moved. Medics were sent out, civilians were gathered, and order slowly began to return. Elias glanced at her with something close to approval. Not bad, princess. For the first time, Ysilura felt what it truly meant to lead, not from a throne, but from the heart of a crisis. And standing beside Elias, she realized she was no longer just an observer. She was part of the fight. The colony's fires had finally been extinguished. In the quiet aftermath, Ysilura stood outside a temporary medical tent, the faint light of the settlement's artificial sun casting long shadows across the scorched earth. Her normally flawless composure was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. Around her, civilians huddled together, whispering thanks to the Celestine guards and human volunteers who had brought them to safety. Inside the tent, Captain Elias Ward was leaning over a makeshift map of the area. His face was serious, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had just finished helping coordinate a defense perimeter around the settlement, ensuring the rogue faction couldn't return to cause more destruction. Ysilura stepped into the tent, her voice soft but steady. The civilians are safe for now. You did well. Elias glanced up, a small smirk forming despite the exhaustion visible in his eyes. It wasn't just me, princess. You handled the guards. Gave them orders when they froze up. That made the difference. She considered his words, a faint warmth spreading through her chest. I simply did what needed to be done. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, Elias said, folding the map and setting it aside. When things fall apart, you have to hold it all together. Not everyone can do that. Ysilura felt the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, she wondered if he could see the cracks in her calm. She had never doubted her abilities before, but standing here, away from the palace, she realized how little she truly knew about conflict. Diplomacy had always been her strength. This was something else. I have always relied on order, she admitted, on rules and structure. Out here, it feels. She hesitated, searching for the right word. Messy, Elias offered. Yes, she agreed. Messy. Unpredictable. Elias shrugged. Welcome to the real world. But messy doesn't mean hopeless. You've got the brains for strategy and the heart to care about people. That's a solid foundation. Ysilura looked at him, surprised by the simple sincerity in his voice. He was not trying to flatter her, nor was he lecturing her. He was simply stating what he saw. You make it sound simple, she said. It's not, he replied, his smile fading slightly. But the best leaders I've known, The ones who made it through hell and back weren't perfect. They were just willing to keep going, no matter how bad things got. The princess nodded slowly, the words settling into her mind. Elias's confidence, born from countless battles and hard decisions, was something she admired. And yet she realized she had her own strength, one that came from years of quiet resolve and the ability to listen and understand. They were different, but somehow their differences complemented each other. For the first time, Ysilara began to think that perhaps she and Elias were more alike than she had imagined. Together, they might just have what it took to face the challenges ahead. The rogue faction made their move at dusk. From the edges of the damaged settlement, shadowy figures emerged, their energy weapons glinting faintly under the pale light. Princess Ysilara stood on a makeshift command platform, her heart pounding despite the composed expression she maintained. Behind her, Captain Elias Ward stood ready, his rifle in hand and a sharp determination in his eyes. "They're testing our defenses," Elias muttered, scanning the approaching enemy lines. "Trying to see if we'll break." Ysilara's voice was steady, even as the tension built. "Then we show them we won't." The Celestine guards, emboldened by their leader's calm presence, held their positions. Although they were more accustomed to ceremonial roles than battlefield conditions, Ysilara had taken time over the past day to speak with them, inspire them, and remind them of their duty to protect the innocent. It showed now in their resolve. No one faltered. As the first shots fired, Elias barked quick orders. "Suppressive fire on the left flank. Keep them pinned. Don't let them push closer." Ysilara observed how efficiently the soldiers moved under his command. Despite their differences, they had begun to trust Elias's experience. The Celestine guards worked in tandem with the human soldiers who had arrived to assist, forming the united front against the attackers. Elias glanced over his shoulder. "You sure you want to stay up here, Princess? This is the thick of it." Ysilara's response was quiet but firm. "I am not leaving my people." Elias gave a quick nod. "All right then, just stay low and keep giving them something to rally behind." The rogue faction's assault intensified. Explosions rocked the ground, and for a moment, the defenders wavered. Ysilara raised her voice, cutting through the chaos. "Hold the line. Protect the colony." Her words carried a weight that seemed to steady the soldiers. They pushed back harder, firing with renewed determination. Elias, too, pressed forward, leading the small team to flank the enemy. His strategy was risky, but it worked. The attackers were caught off guard and began to scatter. The battle raged on, and as the night deepened, the tide turned in favor of the defenders. With a final coordinated push, the rogue faction retreated, leaving behind their wrecked equipment and scattered forces. The settlement was safe, for now. As silence fell over the battlefield, Ysilara finally allowed herself to exhale. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and the ground was littered with debris, but they had held. The civilians were safe, and the enemy had been driven back. Elias approached, his uniform streaked with dirt, and his face marked by exhaustion. "Not bad for a bunch of palace guards, huh?" Ysilara managed a faint smile. "Not bad at all." The victory was hard-won, but it was theirs. In that moment, as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Ysilara knew she had taken a step into a world she had never fully understood. And with Elias by her side, she found herself ready for whatever came next. The settlement stirred with the quiet sounds of morning. The battle was over, and the colony's inhabitants were slowly returning to what remained of their homes. The air was still heavy with the faint scent of smoke, but the sense of relief was palpable. They had survived. Princess Ysilara stood at the edge of the encampment, looking out over the recovering settlement. Her long, elegant robe was stained with ash, her face marked with a weariness she had never felt before. And yet, she stood tall. The events of the last few days had changed her. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. Captain Elias Ward approached, his usual easygoing demeanor softened by exhaustion. His uniform was scuffed, his hair untidy, but his sharp eyes still carried a spark of determination. "The civilians are settling back in," he said. "We've got guards posted in case those rogues try anything, but I don't think they'll be back soon." Ysilara nodded. "We owe much to your leadership, Captain." Elias waved a hand dismissively. "It wasn't just me. Your people stepped up. And you, well, you surprised me, Princess." A small smile played at the edges of her lips. "I surprised myself." She looked out at the bustling colonists. "This is the first time I've stood in the middle of a crisis rather than observing from a distance. I've always thought diplomacy could solve every problem, but now I see it's not so simple." Elias crossed his arms, leaning slightly against a nearby railing. "Diplomacy's a good start, but when things get messy, it helps to have someone who can keep their cool." He glanced at her. "You've got that. Plus, you care about these people. That's more than half the battle." She considered his words. It was true. Despite the chaos, despite the fear, she had not abandoned the colony. She had stayed, she had led, and together with Elias, she had found a way through the storm. "I never expected to rely on a human soldier," she admitted. Elias chuckled. "And I never expected a princess to stick around when things got ugly." His tone softened. "But here we are." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing and workers rebuilding. The colony would recover, and so would the people. But the real change was in the bond that had formed between two individuals from very different worlds. Ysilara finally turned to Elias. "When I return to the palace, I will ensure the Dominion does more to protect the outer colonies. We cannot let this happen again." Elias nodded. "Good. They'll need it." She extended her hand. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Elias looked at her hand, then shook it with a warm smile. "Anytime, Princess." As the sun rose higher, the settlement began to come alive with hope. It was a new day for the colony, for the Dominion, and for the fragile but growing partnership between a calm alien princess and an unconventional human soldier.